Passive-aggressive people will smile at you, while quietly punishing you emotionally at the same time. And if you do not understand the psychology behind this behavior, you will spend years feeling confused, anxious, emotionally drained, and constantly blaming yourself for problems you did not create. Because passive-aggressive people rarely tell you directly what they feel, instead, they make you feel it through silence, coldness, sarcasm, distance, delayed responses, strange energy shifts that make you overthink everything. And the worst part is, when you finally ask what is wrong, they often act like nothing happened. That is what makes passive aggression psychologically exhausting. You can feel the tension clearly, but the other person refuses to acknowledge it openly. And if you stay until the end of this video, you are going to understand something most people never realize. Passive-aggressive behavior is not just bad communication. It is often hidden resentment mixed with emotional avoidance and indirect control. That changes everything. Have you ever been around someone who says, "I'm fine," but suddenly their entire energy changes, their tone changes, their warmth disappears, their responses become shorter, they start acting distant, and now you are sitting there trying to figure out, what did I do wrong? That emotional confusion is not accidental. It is part of the psychology, because passive-aggressive people communicate emotions indirectly instead of honestly, and over time, that creates emotional instability for the people around them. Think about how emotionally healthy communication works. If an emotionally mature person feels hurt, they usually say it directly. They communicate clearly. They address the issue openly. But passive-aggressive people often avoid direct honesty completely. Why? Because direct communication requires emotional courage. It requires vulnerability. It requires risking conflict. And many passive-aggressive people fear those things deeply. So instead of saying, "I'm angry," they punish indirectly. Instead of saying, "That hurt me," they withdraw emotionally. Instead of saying, "I disagree," they use sarcasm, coldness, or emotional distance. That is why passive aggression often feels emotionally dishonest, because the words and the energy never match. Someone says, "Do whatever you want," while clearly wanting you to feel guilty. Someone says, "It's okay," while emotionally punishing you afterward. Someone says, "I'm not upset," while acting resentful for days. And when words and behavior constantly contradict each other, people become emotionally confused. That confusion matters psychologically, because confused people start overthinking themselves. Now your focus shifts away from your own emotions and toward decoding theirs. You begin analyzing, did I upset them? Why are they acting different? What should I say? How do I fix this tension? And that is where passive-aggressive people quietly gain emotional power. Not through direct dominance, through emotional ambiguity. That is why passive-aggressive relationships often feel mentally exhausting. You never fully relax emotionally. You never know where you stand. You constantly feel like something is wrong, but nobody will say it directly. And the human nervous system struggles deeply inside emotionally unpredictable environments. Because emotional unpredictability creates anxiety, this is why people who spend years around passive-aggressive individuals often become hyper-vigilant emotionally. They start monitoring everything: tone changes, facial expressions, response times, energy shifts, silence. They become emotionally alert all the time, trying to prevent tension before it happens. And eventually, they stop feeling emotionally safe inside the relationship entirely. That is one of the most damaging effects of passive aggression. It trains people to walk on emotional eggshells. And many passive-aggressive people do not even realize how emotionally manipulative this becomes over time. Because a lot of passive-aggressive behavior is learned unconsciously, some people grew up in homes where direct emotions felt unsafe. Maybe anger caused rejection. Maybe conflict created punishment. Maybe honest communication was ignored. So they learned to hide emotions instead of expressing them directly. But hidden emotions do not disappear. They leak out sideways. That is why passive-aggressive people often appear emotionally calm on the surface, while quietly creating emotional tension underneath. And because the behavior is indirect, they can always deny responsibility later. That is another important psychological dynamic. Passive aggression protects people from accountability. If someone openly insults you, the behavior is obvious, but passive aggression lives in deniability. It was just a joke. You're overreacting. I didn't mean it like that. You're too sensitive. That is why passive aggression often creates self-doubt in others, because now you start questioning your own emotional reality. You felt the hostility, you sensed the resentment, but the other person denies it. And over time, that emotional contradiction becomes psychologically draining. This is also why emotionally mature people dislike passive aggression deeply, because healthy communication depends on clarity, directness, honesty, emotional accountability. Passive aggression destroys all of those things. Instead of resolving tension, it extends tension. Instead of creating understanding, it creates confusion. Instead of honesty, it creates emotional guessing games. And emotionally mature people eventually stop participating in those games. They stop chasing emotional clarity from emotionally indirect individuals. That is one of the biggest shifts emotionally healthy people make. They stop trying to force honesty out of people who refuse to communicate honestly. Because eventually you realize something important. You cannot build emotional safety with someone who punishes honesty while rewarding confusion. Read that again carefully. You cannot build emotional safety with someone who punishes honesty while rewarding confusion. That is why passive-aggressive people often struggle around emotionally direct individuals. Direct people ask clear questions. Direct people address tension immediately. Direct people communicate emotions openly. And emotionally immature people often feel uncomfortable around that level of honesty. Because honesty removes emotional ambiguity, and emotional ambiguity is where passive aggression survives. That is why passive-aggressive people often become defensive when confronted calmly, not because they do not understand the behavior, but because direct communication removes their emotional protection system. Now the hidden resentment becomes visible. Now accountability enters the conversation. And emotionally avoidant people often struggle deeply with accountability. Have you ever noticed how passive-aggressive people rarely fully resolve conflict? Instead, they drag emotional tension out over long periods of time, days, weeks, sometimes years, because unresolved tension quietly gives them emotional leverage. As long as confusion exists, control exists. That is why passive aggression is closely connected to emotional control. The person may not consciously think, "I want control," but psychologically, the behavior creates it. Because now everyone around them becomes emotionally focused on managing their moods, trying not to upset them, trying to avoid tension, trying to keep emotional peace. And slowly, the relationship becomes emotionally centered around their unresolved emotions. That is exhausting. And over time, people lose themselves inside those dynamics. They stop expressing honest feelings. They suppress needs. They over-explain themselves constantly. They become emotionally anxious. Why? Because passive-aggressive environments train people to prioritize emotional survival over emotional authenticity. That is why emotionally strong people eventually stop tolerating chronic passive aggression. Not because they are cold, but because emotionally healthy people value clarity more than emotional games. And here is the deeper truth most people never realize. Passive aggression is often hidden powerlessness. People who communicate indirectly usually feel emotionally powerless internally. They fear rejection. They fear conflict. They fear vulnerability. So instead of expressing emotions openly, they attempt to regain emotional control indirectly, through guilt, through silence, through withdrawal, through emotional tension. That does not excuse the behavior, but understanding the psychology helps you stop personalizing it. Because many passive-aggressive people are fighting emotional battles they never learned how to communicate properly. Still, understanding behavior does not mean tolerating unhealthy behavior forever. That distinction matters. You can understand someone's wounds without allowing those wounds to control your emotional peace. And emotionally mature people eventually learn this lesson deeply. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. That is why emotional maturity changes relationships so dramatically. Emotionally mature people communicate clearly. They say what they feel directly. They address discomfort honestly. They do not punish people emotionally instead of communicating. And once you experience emotionally healthy communication, passive aggression becomes impossible to ignore. Because healthy communication feels peaceful, clear, safe. You do not spend hours decoding energy shifts. You do not constantly question yourself emotionally. You do not feel trapped inside emotional confusion. Real connection creates clarity, not anxiety, not emotional guessing games, not hidden resentment disguised as silence. And once you understand this psychology clearly, you stop chasing emotional approval from emotionally unavailable people. You stop over-explaining yourself constantly. You stop carrying responsibility for emotions that were never yours to manage. And for the first time in a long time, you begin protecting your peace instead of chasing emotional clarity from people committed to confusion. That is the moment emotional freedom begins.